Commander Zilith stepped off her shuttle and felt the weight of Kier Station press against her senses like a living thing, and the smell hit her first. Blood and fear and the sharp chemical tang of alien bodies packed close together in corridors that had never known proper ventilation. She was Rani, a species known throughout the galaxy for their military discipline and their unfortunate biology that broadcast their emotions through scent, and right now, she was working very hard to keep her pheromones under control, because showing weakness in a place like this could get you killed faster than any blade of station existed in the lawless space between empires, a massive structure built from the hulls of dead warships welded together over centuries, and it served one purpose above all others: violence for entertainment, fights to the death that drew gamblers and criminals and desperate souls from 100 different worlds. Aleth had been sent here by the Rani High Council on a mission she suspected was meant to fail, and they wanted her to recruit a specific fighter for an assassination that everyone believed was impossible. And if she died trying, then at least she would no longer be a political problem for certain powerful individuals who disliked her tendency to speak truth. To Authoridish made her way through crowded corridors where species of every shape and size pressed against each other, and she saw Craner mercenaries with their bone-plated hides standing next to small scurrying Mythi traders. As she passed gambling dens where fortunes changed hands with every fight, broadcast on flickering screens, the arena master's office sat at the heart of the station, and the door opened to reveal a Marillion named SK who had too many eyes clustered across his bulbous head, and his mandibles clicked together in what might have been amusement or hunger as he examined her military uniform. "Velrani, Commander," he said, and his voice buzzed through a translator implant that rendered his words in flat, mechanical tones. "You are far from home and far from welcome here, so speak quickly about what you want before I decide you would make better entertainment than customer." Zilith kept her posture rigid and her fierce scent locked down tight as she spoke with all the authority she could muster. "I am here to hire a fighter," she said. "One they call the Silencer, the human known as Mara Cole." The change in SK was immediate and dramatic, and his many eyes blinked in a rippling wave while his mandibles stopped their clicking, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as if she had said something profoundly stupid. "You want to hire the human?" he asked, and something in his voice had shifted from predatory amusement to what sounded almost like nervousness. "You want to speak with Mara Cole and ask her to work for you. I have been authorized to offer substantial payment, scripted with a harsh, clicking laugh. "The human does not fight for payment, Commander, and she fights because fighting is what she is. And I have seen many dangerous creatures pass through my arena, but I have never seen anything like her." Zilith had heard stories about humans during her career, wild tales from frontier colonies about a species from a small wet planet on the edge of explored space, and the stories spoke of impossible endurance and a refusal to die that bordered on the supernatural, but she had always dismissed such talk as primitive superstition spread by those who had never faced real military threats. "I need to see her," Zilith said firmly. "Where can I find this human?" SCF's mandibles clicked rapidly in what she now recognized as nervous laughter. "She fights tonight he said in the main arena against 3K for berserkers who have each killed over 100 opponents, and you should watch the fight before you decide if you truly wish to speak with her, because I think once you see what she is, you will change your mind. About this recruitment, he led her through more corridors and up into the viewing galleries that surrounded the central arena, a massive pit carved from the station's core where thousands of spectators from dozens of species gathered to watch blood sport, and Zilith found a place near the front where she could see clearly as the lights dimmed and the crowd roared with anticipation. First fighters entered from the far side, 3CF or berserkers, each standing 9 ft tall with muscles like coiled steel cables beneath their bone-plated skin, and they carried massive axes designed to shatter armor and split bodies in half, and their tough faces twisted with drug-enhanced rage as they bellowed challenges to their opponent. Then the opposite door opened, and a single figure walked out. Mara Cole was smaller than Zilith had expected, standing perhaps 5'1" ft tall, with a lean, muscular build, wrapped in simple fighting clothes, and her skin was a warm brown color marked with pale scars that crossed her arms and face, and her hair was cut short and practical, and her eyes were the gray color of storm clouds or dead starch. Carried no weapons. Crowd fell into confused murmurs as the human walked to the center of the arena and simply stood there with her hands at her sides while 3 massive berserkers charged toward her with axes raised. Edgelith felt her fear sent spike despite her best efforts to control if first Kaner swung his axe in a blow that should have split the human in two, but Mara moved at the last possible instant with a twist of her body that seemed to defy the physics of momentum, and the axe blade passed close enough to trim her hair while she stepped inside the berserker's reach. What happened next burned itself into Zilith's memory. Human's hand shot out, and her fingers found the soft tissue beneath the Kree jaw, and she punched through the unarmored flesh with a wet, tearing sound and ripped something vital free, and the berserker collapsed, gurgling, while Mara was already moving toward the second opponent, fought like nothing Zilith had ever seen, not with the elegant forms of trained warriors or the wild chaos of berserkers, but with something else entirely, a brutal, efficient economy of motion that wasted nothing and targeted weakness with predatory precision. Second Krier managed to land a blow that should have shattered her ribs, but the human simply absorbed the impact with a grunt and grabbed the axe handle and used it to pull herself closer, and her forehead cracked against the berserker's face with a sound like breaking stone. Third berserker Hezilith watched as the massive warrior actually took a step backward, and she saw something she had never expected to see in a Creole. Smiled, and it was not a kind smile, and then she moved. When the arena lights came up fully, Zilith realized her hands were shaking, and her fear scent was pouring off her body in waves she could not control, and she understood with terrible clarity that everything she had heard about humans was not superstition. It was understatement. She had to find this human and convince her to help with the mission, and she had absolutely no idea how she was going to do that when every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. Zilith found the fighter quarters in the lower levels of Kithra Station, where the air was thick and hot, and the corridors were stained with old blood that no one had bothered to clean, and she walked past doors behind which other fighters rested, or prepared or nursed their wounds, and she felt their eyes on her uniform, through small windows and gaps in metal. Plating door to Mara Cole's room was unmarked and unremarkable, just another piece of battered metal in a corridor, full of battered metal, but Zilith noticed that none of the other fighters had quarters anywhere nearby. And there was an empty space around this door, like a bubble of fear that kept others at a distance. She pressed the signal button and waited. Its open came a voice from inside, flat and calm and somehow more unsettling for its lack of emotions. Pushed through the door and stepped into a small room lit by harsh white lights, and she saw Mara Cole sitting on a metal bench with her shirt removed and a curved needle in her hand, and the human was stitching closed a wound on her shoulder that went deep enough to show the white gleam of bone beneath torn musk leather. Was no anesthetic visible anywhere in the room, and the human's hands were perfectly steady as she pulled thread through her own flesh. "You're the Velrani who was watching from the front gallery," Mara said, without looking up from her work, and her voice carried the same flat calm as before. "You smell like military command, structure, and political desperation, which means someone sent you here to recruit me for something dangerous." Zilith felt a cold shock run through her body as she realized this human could read her pheromones, could smell the emotions she had tried so hard to hide, and she understood now why other species talked about humans as if they were predators wearing the shape of civilized beings. "I am Commander Zilith of the Velroni Third Fleet," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And yes, I have been sent to request your assistance with a mission of great importance." "Sit down," Mara said as she gestured toward a second bench with the hand that held the bloody needle. "Me who needs to die." Zilith sat because she did not know what else to do, and she watched as the human finished stitching her wound with quick, efficient movements, and she noticed for the first time the full extent of the scars that covered Mara's body, hundreds of them crossing her skin in patterns that spoke of violence survived over many years. "How do you do that?" Zilith asked before she could stop herself. "How do you push a needle through your own flesh without any pain?" "Medication." Mara looked up in her gray eyes met Zilith and LT Unk and GTS and the Rani. Commander felt her fear surge. "Despite every effort to control, pain is information," the human said simply. "It tells you that something is wrong with your body, and once you know that information, you can choose what to do with it, and I choose to set it aside and deal with it later, because right now I have other things to focus on." She tied off the final stitch and reached for a clean shirt, pulling it on over the fresh wound without any visible discomfort. "Your fear scent is very strong," Mara continued, and there was something that might have been amusement in her voice. "You smell like a prey animal that has just realized it walked into a predator's den, which is interesting because the Rani are supposed to be one of the most dangerous military species in the galaxy." "We are," Zilith said, and she forced steel into her voice. "But I watched you kill 3 KFER berserkers in less than 2 minutes, using nothing but your bare hands, and I watched you take a blow that should have shattered your ribs and simply keep fighting, and I do not think anyone could witness that and not feel some fear." Mara smiled, and it was the same not kind smile Zilith had seen in the arena. "Good," the human said. "Fear is also information, and it tells you that you are in the presence of something dangerous, and unlike most species who try to hide from that information or pretend it does not exist, you are sitting here acknowledging it honestly. She leaned back against the wall and studied Zilith with those cold gray eyes. So tell me about this mission that was important enough to send a military commander into the lawless zones to find a human fighter. Zilith took a breath and began to speak, laying out the situation with the precision of a military briefing. The warlord Dexon has united 7 systems under his control and is preparing to invade Velroni space, she said. He commands a fleet of over 3,000 warships and an army of fanatical soldiers who believe he is blessed by their gods and our military. Analysts estimate that we will lose the coming war within 6 months, and your high command wants him dead before the invasion begins, Mara said, nodding slowly. That is logical, but I assume assassination attempts have already failed, or you would not be looking for outside help. 11 teams have been sent. Zilith admitted none have returned, and the last team was captured alive and executed publicly to demonstrate that Vexen cannot be touched. 11 teams of Velani Special Forces failed to kill one warlord, Mara said, and her voice carried something that sounded like professional interest. Tell me more about his security arrangements. Zilith spent the next hour describing everything the Rani intelligence services had learned about the Zanis fortress, his personal guards, his habits and weaknesses, and the layout of his compound. And throughout her briefing, she noticed that Mara asked precise questions that revealed a deep understanding of military tactics and assassination methodology. Why do you fight in arena pits? Zilith finally asked when the briefing was complete. You clearly have military training, and you could command high prices as a mercenary commander or security consultant, so why do you stay in a place like this and fight for entertainment? Mara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice had lost some of its flat calm. I was a soldier once, she said. I fought in the war at Proxima when my species was nearly wiped out by an enemy who wanted to exterminate us, and I was one of 43 survivors from a force of 12,000. Zilith felt her breath catch because she knew about Proxima. Everyone in the galaxy knew about Proxima, and it was the first time most species had truly understood what humans were capable of when pushed to the edge of extinction. The burning of Proxima, she said quietly. Vexen led that attack, Mara said, and her gray eyes had gone hard as stone. He commanded the fleet that bombed our colonies and hunted our survivors through the ruins, and I have spent the last 8 years looking for a way to get close enough to kill him. She stood and extended her hand toward Zilith in what the commander recognized as a human gesture of agreement. You do not need to pay me for this mission, Mara said. I will come with you, and I will help you kill Vexen, and in exchange I ask only one thing. Name it, Zilith said. When we reach him, Mara said, and her voice was very quiet now. I want to be the one who ends his life. Zilith took the human's hand and felt the rough calluses and the strength beneath warm skin, and she knew she was making a deal with something her ancestors would have called a monster. But right now she needed a monster, and she could not hide her fear, and somehow that seemed exactly right. The journey from Kier Station to the edge of Vexenus Territory would take 12 days through hostile space, and Zilith's ship was a Rani military cruiser named the Swift Blade that carried a crew of 47 hardened soldiers who had served together through 3 major conflicts. When Mara Cole came aboard, everything changed at first. In the way her crew moved through the corridors, the way they would stop talking when the human approached and pressed themselves against walls to give her room to pass, and the way they watched her with the careful attention of prey animals tracking a predator they knew could kill them faster than they could. Lieutenant Korth approached Zilith on the 3rd day with worry written across his scaled features. "Commander," he said in a low voice, "the crew is unsettled by our passenger, and some of them are having difficulty sleeping knowing she is aboard. Have there been any incidents?" Zilla asked. "Nothing direct," admitted, "but yesterday I saw weapons specialist then drop a plasma cutter on his own foot because the human walked past the maintenance bay, and this morning the kitchen staff served her food without being asked because they were too frightened to deny her anything." Zilith sighed and rubbed her temple ridges where a headache was forming. "She is not a threat to this crew," she said. "She is our ally for this mission. With respect, Commander, the crew does not feel safe, and I do not believe they will perform at full effectiveness if this continues." Zilith knew her lieutenant was right, and she also knew that she needed to address this situation before it became a serious problem, so she went looking for Mara and found her in the ship's small gymnasium running on a machine designed for physiology. Human had been running for 6 hours without stopping. "Your crew is afraid of me," Mara said, without breaking her stride, and sweat dripped from her face, but her breathing was still controlled and even. "I can smell their fear through the ventilation system whenever I move through the ship." "Yes," Zilith admitted, "they are good soldiers, but they have never encountered a human before, and the stories they have heard are making them nervous." Mara finally slowed the machine and stepped off, grabbing a cloth to wipe her face, while Zilith tried not to stare at the impossible duration of the workout she had just witnessed. "What stories?" the human asked. "They say your species does not sleep the way others do." Zilith said, "that you remain partially awake even in rest and can respond to threats within seconds of being disturbed." "That is true," Mara said. "They say your bodies produce natural chemicals during combat that block pain and increase strength and speed, that you can fight through wounds that would kill other species." "Also true. They say humans can survive environments that would kill anyone else: extreme heat and cold, lack of water, toxic atmospheres, injuries that should be fatal, and that you simply refuse to die, even when all logic says you should." Mara sat down on a bench and looked at Zilith with something that might have been curiosity. "All of that is true," she said. "Humans evolved on a planet that was constantly trying to kill us, and we developed these abilities because those who did not have them died, and we are what is left after millions of years of surviving everything that wanted us dead. That is what frightens my crew." Zilith said quietly, "You are a species shaped by survival, and when they look at you, they see something their instincts tell them is dangerous beyond anything they have faced before." Marrow was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had softened slightly. "Your species surrendered when you faced extinction," she said. "In your first great war, the Velroni realized they could not win, and they negotiated peace rather than face destruction, and that is not a criticism, because it was the logical choice that saved your people, but humans did not surrender at Proxima. Zilith said no. Mara agreed, we did not surrender. Because we could not, because something in our nature makes it impossible for us to stop fighting, even when every rational calculation says we should, and that is what your crew is sensing when they look at me. She met Zilith and LT, Unk and GT. Eyes with that cold gray stare. They are afraid because they understand on some level that if I wanted to kill everyone on this ship, I could do it, and nothing they could do would stop me, and they are right to understand that. Zilith felt her fear sense spike and knew the human could smell it, but I am not going to hurt your crew, Mara continued, because I am not a monster. Even if I am dangerous, and I am here to kill Vexen because he murdered my people, not because I enjoy killing. Then help me explain that to my soldier, Zilith said. Mara nodded slowly and stood up. Call them together, she said. Let me speak to them and tell them about Proxima, and maybe if they understand what happened, they will be less afraid of what I am. An hour later, the crew of the Swift Blade gathered in the main briefing room, and Zilith watched their faces as Mara Cole stood before them and began to speak in that flat, calm voice about the day the war came to her. Keynes told them about waking to the sound of bombardment and running through streets filled with fire and falling debris, about watching her family die in a blast that leveled their home, about being 14 years old and picking up a weapon from a dead soldier and deciding that she would fight until there was nothing left of her to fight with. Told them about the weeks that followed, about hiding in ruins and ambushing enemy patrols, about eating whatever they could find and sleeping in shifts and watching friends die one by one until there were hardly any left. Shah told them about the final stand when 43 human survivors faced an army of thousands and refused to surrender, about fighting for 18 hours straight until rescue ships finally arrived, about the moment when she realized she was still alive and was not entirely sure she wanted to be. When she finished speaking, the room was silent, and Zilith could smell the change in her crew's pheromones. The fear was still there, but it had shifted into something else, something that might have been respect or even compassion. I did not choose to be what I am, Mara said, but I will use what I am to kill the being who destroyed my home, and if you help me do that, then I will owe you a debt that my species does not forget. Lieutenant Core stepped forward and extended his hand in the human gesture he must have researched. We will help you, he said, and we are honored to fight alongside someone who survived what you survived. Mara took his hand, and for the first time, Zilith saw something that looked like genuine emotion cross the human scarred face. Thank you, Mara said quietly. After that, the crew still gave her room to passing cowards, but now it felt less like fear and more like the respect warriors show to someone who has earned their admiration through deeds too terrible to fully imagine. Zilith began to understand that maybe being feared was not the same as being a monster, and maybe the galaxy needed beings like Mara Cole to remind it what the price of cruelty truly was. The plan was simple in concept and nearly impossible execution. Infiltrate Dex and S Fortress world using forged merchant credentials. Make contact with resistance fighters who had been working to undermine the warlord from within, and find a path to the inner sanctum where Exxon ruled over his empire of conquest in Troor. Everything went wrong within the first. Hersilith realized they had been betrayed the moment their shuttle touched down at the merchant port, and she saw the welcoming committee waiting on the landing pad. 50 soldiers in the black armor of Vexenus personal guards, surrounding a tall figure in ceremonial robes who smiled with too many teeth. Commander Zilith, the robed figure, called out as the shuttle doors opened. The sovereign welcomes you to his domain and wishes to extend his hospitality to you and your companions. How Zilith breathed, her fear scent flooding the shuttle's interior. How did they know? Traitor in your high command, Mara said flatly, and her gray eyes were scanning the soldiers with the calculating attention of a predator assessing threats. Someone sold this mission. Before we even left space, there was no chance of escape. The soldiers had plasma weapons trained on every exit, and more troops were approaching from the surrounding buildings. And Zith's team of 12 elite operatives had pistols and knives against an army. We surrender, Zilith called out, raising her hands. We request the protections granted to prisoners of war under galactic convention. The robed figure laughed, and the sound was cold and sharp. The sovereign does not recognize galactic conventions, he said. You are enemies, captured in his territory, and you will face whatever judgment he sees fit to deliver. They were bound in neurolocks, devices that clamped around the wrists and spine and sent constant pulses of disabling energy through the nervous system, making it impossible to coordinate movement or resist. And Zilith felt her body go slack and unresponsive as the soldiers dragged her and her team through cores of black stone toward the heart of the fortress throne. Room was vast and dark, lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows across walls carved with scenes of conquest and suffering, and at the far end sat the being Zilith had come to kill, where Lord Dexon was ancient and massive, creature of segmented kitten and clicking mandibles, who had ruled his territory for over 100 years, and his compound eyes reflected the torch light like 1,000 tiny flames as he studied the prisoners being dragged before him. Assassins, he said, and his voice buzzed through the chamber like the sound of insects swarming. This is the 7th team your people have sent against me, and I am beginning to find it tiresome. 11th, Mara corrected from where she knelt among the other prisoners, and her voice was calm despite the neurolock pulsing against her spine. Effects and attention shifted to her immediately, and Zilith watched the warlord's massive body go still in a way that spoke of sudden recognition. A human, he breathed, and something changed in his posture that looked almost like hesitation. I know your kind, and I remember what you are. You should, Mara said. You burned my colony on Proxima and hunted my people through the ruins, and I was 14 years old when I watched my family die in fire you ordered dropped from orbit. The throne room fell silent, and Zilith saw the soldiers exchange nervous glances beneath their helmets. I burned many human colonies, Vexen said slowly. Your species was expanding too quickly and needed to be contained, and the fire was the most efficient solution. 43 of us survived, Mara continued, and her voice was still that terrible calm. 43 out 12,000, and we fought for 18 hours until rescue came, and I made a promise to myself on that day that I would find you, and I would kill you, no matter how long It took. Dexon leaned forward on his throne, and his compound eyes studied the human with what might have been fascination. You cannot kill me, he said. You are bound in neural locks, designed to prevent any coordinated movement, and you are surrounded by my guards in my fortress in the heart of my territory, and there is nothing you can do. You should have made sure we were all dead, Mara said quietly, and she dislocated both of her shoulders. Shilith heard the wet popping sound as the human's joints separated from their sockets, and she watched in horror as Mara pulled her arms through the neuralock restraints that were sized for normal body proportions, and the human rose to her feet with her arms hanging loose and wrong at her sides. What? Vexen Bean. Mara slammed her shoulder against the stone pillar, and her left arm snapped back into its socket with another terrible pop, and she did the same with her right arm. And by the time the guards realized what was happening, she had already grabbed the pistol from the nearest soldier's holsters, shot out. The light's throne room plunged into darkness, and Zilith heard screaming in plasma fire and the wet sounds of violence that her mind refused to fully process, and she felt someone grab her bound arms and drag her behind a fallen pillar. Stay down, Mara's voice said in her ear, and then the human was gone. As I could not see what happened next, but she could hear it, the sounds of combat that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the screams of dying soldiers and the crash of bodies hitting stone, and through it all the steady, controlled breathing of a single human moving through an army like death itself. A soldier stumbled past Zilith's hiding place, and she saw his face in the brief flash of plasma fire. He was terrified beyond reason, firing wildly into the darkness at an enemy he could not see or understand. Then something grabbed him, and he was gone. Emergency lights finally flickered on, and Zilith saw the throne room transformed into a Cheryl house, bodies everywhere, blood pooling on the black stone floor, and at the center of it all, Myra Cole standing over Warlord Dexon with a blade pressed against his throat. Human was wounded badly. Zilith could see a deep puncture in her side that bubbled with blood when she breathed, and one of her legs was twisted at an angle that meant the knee was shattered, and there were cuts across her face and arms that dripped crimson onto the floor. But she was standing, and Nexon was on his knees before her in the warlord's compound. Eyes reflected something Zilith had never expected to see in them, fear. Please, Vexen said, and his voice had lost all its power and authority. I will give you anything you want. Territory, wealth, ships, just spare my life. Mara looked down at him with those cold gray eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. You burned my home, she said. You killed my family, and you murdered thousands of my people because you thought we were expanding too quickly. I was wrong, Beekson said desperately. I see that now, and I will make amends. No, Mara, and she ended. Himzith finally managed to deactivate her neuralock and stumbled toward the human just as Mi's legs gave out, and she caught the wounded fighter before she hit the ground. The mission is complete, Mara said, and her voice was wet with blood. You can tell your high command that Thexan is dead. You need medical attention, Zilith said urgently. You have wounds that would have killed anyone else already. Mara smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Zilith had ever seen on her face. I told you, the human said quietly. Humans don't do mathematics in war. What do you do then? Zilith asked Spite. Mara said, we do, Spite, and then she passed out in Zilith and LT, Unk and GT, arms while the fortress burned around them. The medical bay of the Swift Blade was not designed for human physiology, and the ship's doctors had to improvise constantly as they fought to save Mara Cole's life during the desperate journey back to Velrani space, and for 3 days Zilith sat beside the human's bed and watched machines struggle to keep up with a body that seemed determined to heal itself through sheer force of will. List of injuries should have been fatal many times over: a punctured lung that had partially collapsed, a shattered knee that required complete reconstruction, 17 separate wounds from blades and claws, and plasma burns and blood loss that would have killed a Velani twice her size. But Mara's heart kept beating and her wounds kept closing, and on the 4th day she opened her gray eyes and looked at Zilith with an expression of mild confusion. How long? she asked, and her voice was rough from disease. 4 days, Zilith said, and she could not keep the wonder from her voice. Our doctors said you should have died at least 6 times since we left the CES fortress, and they do not understand how you are still alive. Mara tried to sit up and winced as her healing body protested the movement. I told you, she said, humans are stubborn about dying. You killed over 40 soldiers in that throne room. Zilith said, I have watched the security footage from your armor camera, and I still do not fully understand what I saw, because you moved in ways that should not be possible, and you kept fighting through wounds that should have stopped you a dozen times. Mara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual flat calm. When I was young, before Proxima, I used to wonder what I would do if everything I loved was taken from me, she said, and I imagined I would break into pieces and never be whole again. And for a long time after the war, that is exactly what happened. She looked at her scarred hands, turning them over slowly, but somewhere in the darkness I found something else. She continued, I found anger, and I found purpose, and I found the ability to keep moving forward no matter what was done to me, and I decided that I would not let the XNS violence be the end of my story. So you spent 8 years fighting in arena pits and waiting for a chance at revenge, Zilith said. Yes, Mara admitted, and I am not proud of all the things I did during those years, but I survived, and now Vexen is dead and my people are avenged, and I do not know what comes next. Zilith leaned forward and took the human's hand in her own, feeling the rough calluses and the strength that still remained even after such terrible wounds. Come back to Velrani Prime with me, she said. You have done my people a great service by killing Nexon before his invasion could begin, and you will be received as a hero and given whatever rewards you desire. Me and LT Unk and GT's gray eyes studied her for a long moment. I do not want rewards, she said, and I do not think I would make a good hero for your people, because I am the broken in ways that do not show on the surface. Then what do you want? Zilith asked. I want to keep fighting, Mara said slowly, not for revenge anymore, but for something else, for the people who cannot fight for themselves, for the colonies that face threats they cannot defeat alone, for anyone who needs someone willing to walk into the darkness on their behalf. Zilith felt something shift in her understanding of the human before her, and she realized that Mara was not the monster she had first appeared to be. In that arena, Anchiation was something more complicated and more valuable. Weapon that had chosen its own purpose. A predator that had decided to protect, rather than hunt, a survivor who had transformed her trauma into a shield for others the Rani military could use. Someone like you, Zilith said, not as a soldier bound by our command structure, but as an advisor and specialist who could help us face the threats that our conventional forces cannot handle. You want to hire me, Mara said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice. I want to give you a place where your skills can serve a purpose beyond personal vengeance, Zilith corrected. I want to show you that there are beings in this galaxy who will stand beside you, rather than simply fearing what you are. Mara was quiet for a long time, and Zilith could not read the emotions that moved behind those gray eyes. I have been feared for a very long time, the human finally said, and I have grown used to it, and in some ways I have even embraced it, because fear keeps enemies at a distance and makes battles shorter. But Zilith prompted, but I am tired of being alone, Mara admitted. And I am tired of having no one who knows what I am and chooses to stand with me anyway. She looked at Zilith with something that might have been hope. You could not hide your fear. When we first met, she said, I could smell it pouring off you in waves every time you looked at me, and yet you came to find me anyway, and you asked for my help if I was desperate, Zilith said. Honestly, you were brave, Mara corrected, because you felt the fear, and you chose to act despite it, and that is something I understand very well. She reached out and took Zilith and LT Uncan GT's hand in her own. I will come with you to Vellani Prime, she said, and I will help your military face whatever threats are coming, and in exchange, I ask only that you remember what I am, a human, Zilith said. Yes, Mara agreed, a human, a member of a species that asked the galaxy for peace and received war instead. Species that learned through fire and lost that survival sometimes requires becoming the thing that others fear. She smiled, and this time it was almost gentle. We did not choose to be monsters, she said, but we adapted to survive in a galaxy that treated us as prey, and now the galaxy has to live with what we became. And maybe someday, when the wars are over, we can be something softer again. Until then, Zilith asked. Until then, Mara said, we are exactly what the galaxy needs us to be, the fighters that stand between innocent beings and those who would destroy them, the survivors who refuse to give up no matter how dark things get, the humans who walk into nightmares so that others can sleep peacefully. She squeezed Zilith and LT Uncan GT's hand, and if the galaxy fears us for that, she said, then so be it, because some things are worth being feared for years later. When Zilith commanded her own fleet and had risen to the highest levels of Vellani military leadership, she kept a human advisory unit aboard her flagship and trained her officers to fight alongside human soldiers without letting their instinctive fear control theme of their species question this choice, pointing to the unpredictable nature of humans and the unsettling effect they had on alien crews. And Zilith would simply smile and remember a scarred woman stitching her own wounds without anesthetic. That is precisely why I keep them close, she would say, because in this galaxy, it is better to have human beside you than against you, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, Mara Cole continued her work, the fighter every alien feared. The legend that reminded the galaxy what happened when you underestimated humanity, the living proof that sometimes the smallest species from the quietest corner of space could become the most dangerous force the universe had ever known, not because they wanted to be feared, but because fear was the language that predators understood and humanity had learned to speak it fluently. The galaxy had asked for peace, humanity had received wherein they would never make that mistake again.